Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our new webinar, ISO 9001-2015, an introduction to the world's most popular standard. My name is Joseph Krolikowski. I am the QMS Program Manager for Perry Johnson Registrars. Couple of notes for everyone. All of our participants are on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions. So please utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will address your questions at the conclusion of the presentation. One of the more common questions that we get is regarding the slides. We will definitely be making the slides available shortly after we're finished today. And if you'd like to rewatch this webinar with the full voiceover, it'll be uploaded to our YouTube page shortly after as well, and you'll find a link for that on our website under previously recorded webinars. Our topics for today, we're going to discuss what is ISO 9001, and we're going to do that by way of the scope statement that's provided in section 1 of the standard itself. We're going to kind of deconstruct that statement. We're going to have a little bit of an understanding of where ISO standards come from in the first place. We're going to discuss the impact of Annex SL, what that is, where that comes from, how it influences the content of the standard. We're going to have kind of a cover-to-cover review of the standard and highlight what's where. I've got a special section that I call Key Ideas. Key things that are raised by the standard, things that you need to consider. And I've tried to provide some cross-referencing in terms of clausal information on these ideas. A few concluding remarks, and then your questions. So in terms of what is ISO 9001, well, its official title is Quality Management Systems-Requirements. Now, the intent of the standard is provided in section 1. Now, it's interesting to note that this statement, this scope statement, is unchanged in the past 3 editions of ISO 9001. If you go all the way back to at least the 2000 version of ISO 9001, this statement is entirely unchanged. And it reads as follows. The international standard, this international standard, specifies requirements for a quality management system when an organization needs to demonstrate its ability to consistently provide products and services that meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, and aims to enhance customer satisfaction through the effective application of the system, including processes for improvement of the system and the assurance of conformity to customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. So to understand what ISO 9001 is all about, it's good to take that scope statement in pieces. So let's start with the very beginning, where it says that this international standard specifies requirements for a quality management system. This opening declaration, it establishes a key requirement for the standard and for anybody that wants to use it, and that is that ISO 9001 is not a product standard. It's not going to tell you how to manufacture your product, how to render your service, and so forth. It is not, in that respect, to be taken as equivalent to, say, a UL product certification or a CE mark certification. It is a system standard, a quality management system standard, to be more specific. Any organization that wants to be certified to ISO 9001 is still expected to define for itself and think for itself in terms of how the products are going to be made and controlled. Now the scope then continues. When an organization needs to demonstrate its ability to consistently provide products and services. Now you'll note that the scope includes both products and services. Now if you go back to the early days of ISO 9001, the first 2 editions, the ones that came out in 87 and 94, the thought at that time was that ISO 9001 was primarily going to be for companies that manufactured tangible products. Now, Obviously, as time has gone by, it's become clear that ISO 9001 is meant to be more than just a products type standard. It is meant for companies that both provide products and those that provide services, really any kind of organization. The scope then continues that meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements and aims to enhance customer satisfaction. Now, this is probably the most important part of the scope statement right here, and that is that ISO 9001 demands, as we'll see, that organizations be really dialed into the needs of their customers. There's a lot of places in ISO 9001 where the needs of the customers are brought out and are pronounced, and we'll be highlighting some of these a little bit later in the presentation. Through the effective application of the system, including processes for improvement of the system and assurance of conformity to customer and applicable statutory and regulatory. Now, these final statements in the scope hit on a couple of key things. Number one, that it is an ongoing arrangement. It's not something that you implement and forget about. And then also the whole idea of improvement. And improvement is something that is brought up time and again in the standard. This is actually one of the key ideas that we'll be touching on a little bit later in the presentation. So there's a lot here in the scope statement. There's a lot of meat and a lot of foreshadowing of what's going to be coming in the actual auditable requirements. So in terms of where do standards come from, where does ISO 9001 come from? Well, they come from the ISO, and the ISO is the International Organization for Standardization. Now, who they are a collective. They're made up of numerous international members here in the United States. Our participation comes from the American National Standards Institute. And every standard that ISO publishes, and they publish hundreds of standards. They're standards for all kinds of different applications. Every one of those standards is assigned to a committee. And in the case of ISO 9001, it is a technical committee, TC 176. Now, TC 176 itself, because ISO 9001 is such a widely used standard, it's used in just about every corner of the planet. It's used just about everywhere for all kinds of different industries. There is representation on TC 176 from all over the world. So it's a very globally developed and issued standard. So if you've ever wondered where do these standards come from, they come from the ISO itself. So how is the standard organized? To what do we attribute the ordering of clauses and what's where and why they put it together that way? So to get your arms around why ISO 9001 presents the content in the way that it does, we have to take a look at a key document that was developed 3 years before ISO 9001 2015 was published. And of course, we're talking about Annex SL. So what is Annex SL? Annex SL, you may have heard referred to as the high-level outline, Annex XL. As the name would imply, it is an annex, and it's an annex of a larger ISO publication called Directives Part 1, Consolidated ISO Supplement Procedures specific to ISO. It is a standard on how to write standards and how to approve standards and so forth. It's a self-imposed set of requirements that the ISO wrote and agreed to in terms of developing their publications. Now, if you're so inclined, Directives Part 1 and the SL supplement therein can both be downloaded for free. If you go to iso.org and do a keyword search for Annex SL or for Directives Part 1, you can download it yourself. and have a look at where these standards come from. Now, Annex SL itself was first published back in 2012, and it was outputted from a special committee called the Joint Technical Coordination Group, or JTCG. And what they came up with at that time was a 10-section blueprint, and this blueprint was to be used for authoring all of the ISO family of standards. Their big vision was that in a few years, all of the ISO standards would have the same sections, the same section titles. They would have common terms, core definitions. In other words, if you have a term like organization or a term like customer, those terms would mean the same thing whether you were reading ISO 9001 or ISO 14001 or ISO 37001. So at this point in time now, in 2019, just about every standard that ISO publishes has completed its transition to Annex SL format. Some are still in the midst of being rolled out. We have some where transition deadlines are extending into 2020 or 2021. But for the most part, the mountain has been climbed, so to speak, in terms of the standards having completed the transition process. So here's an example of how Annex SL works. Now on the left, I've given the Annex SL verbiage for section 9.2.1. This is the internal audit requirement. And on the right, I have the same verbiage as it's presented in ISO 9001:2015. Now you'll note a couple of things here. You'll note that in Annex SL, in a couple of key places, there are some X's. The organization shall conduct internal audits at planned intervals to provide information on whether the blank management system. Well, obviously, in ISO 9001, we are referring to a quality management system. And then in subclause 1, A1 rather, it says, conforms to the organization's own requirements for its blank management system. And again, we add the word quality here. Now in subclause 2, we note that the organization's internal audits need to consider the requirements of this international standard. Now in Annex SL, they give this in a couple of different fashions, depending on what type of standard we're developing a spec for. But for the most part, these two statements are virtually the same, and that's the intent. If we write an internal audit requirement for ISO 9001, it should be a very simple matter to have an add-on for one or more of the additional requirements. And that's really what Annex SL was all about. And that's why ISO 9001 is structured and ordered in the manner that it is. So in terms of auditable requirements, the auditable portion of the standard is broken up into 7 pieces, and these begin with section 4. So I've provided the section headers, so to speak, here. So in section 4, we have context of the organization. We touch on interested parties. We touch on the scope. We touch on development of processes. In section 5, this is titled Leadership and Commitment. We have some requirements here that pertain to the development of a policy, a quality policy, defining responsibility and authority. Management commitment is captured here in section 5. In section 6, we have really 2 primary ideas. We have risks and risk actions, and then the big picture of quality objectives. This is also where planning of changes is captured. Section 7 is called support. There's actually quite a few important pieces here. We have competence, so all your training requirements would be captured here. Internal communication, documented information is captured here. Section 7 is also where you'll find the measurement equipment requirements. So calibration requirements are captured here, and so forth. The heart of the standard really is captured in section 8. The day-to-day activities are going to be in Section 8. So this is going to include things like determining requirements for the product, for developing the design of the product if you happen to be design responsible. Your interfaces with external providers are mandated in Section 8. Production and service provision, all of the various controls that go into manufacturing your product, these come from Section 8. And then if you have controls over non-conforming product, those are also captured in Section 8. The standard, the auditable portion of the standard then wraps up in Sections 9 and 10. We have performance evaluation in Section 9. This is kind of a catch-all for the key monitoring activities. So internal audit is captured here. Monitoring of customer satisfaction information is captured here. The management review activity is captured here. And then the improvement section. And I've actually got some comments later on this, but I'll note that this includes continual improvement and also includes corrective action. The concept of corrective action is captured here in Section 10. Now, in terms of cover to cover and what's where, the standard begins with an introduction section. And in point 1, we have an overview statement. We have some comments on who the standard benefits. There's some preliminary introduction to risk-based thinking and Plan, Do, Check, Act, which those are concepts that are revisited time and time again in the standard. The other purpose of section point 1 is to introduce a couple of key terms. And probably the most important of these is shall. The whole idea that a shall statement is mandatory, and the shall is what we hold you primarily accountable to in the context of an audit. The other terms are should, which represents a recommendation. There's actually no uses of the term should within ISO 9001 itself, at least not within the auditable portion. May is more of a permission. This actually comes up once in the auditable content, and then can, what this could mean. And that term is used numerous times in the auditable portion. The introduction section then continues with section 0.2, where we have some discussion on the 7 quality management principles. Now, if you've never read the ISO 9000 standard, this is fundamentals and vocabulary. The 7 quality management principles are kind of a key idea, a key concept, and these inform to a point what's written into ISO 9001 as far as auditable content goes. But these principles, they're in no particular order, but they include focus on the customer, leadership by the management, leadership and engagement of people, the process approach. This is a hugely important idea, process approach. The idea of improvement as not just a set of tasks, but as a concept, a philosophy, if you will. Evidence-based decision-making, this whole idea that we do not proceed blindly when we make decisions in a quality management system. And then what the standard refers to is relationship management. This covers primarily relationships with external providers, but it's intended to be relationship management with all interested parties. That's kind of the big picture in that clause, or in that principle rather. In section 0.3, we have some reinforcement of the importance of the process approach. The whole idea that it is a standard governed by processes. We're going to be revisiting that concept a little later in the presentation. And also this whole idea of Plan, Do, Check, Act. And there's even a grid that is provided, a graphic, if you will, that demonstrates how the sections of the standard themselves follow a Plan, Do, Check, Act methodology. Particularly if you look at sections 4, 5, 6, and 7, you can kind of think of those as the plan portion of the cycle. Section 8 really is due, in plan due. Check would really be the things that are captured in section 9. And then 10 is the action, the act. So the standard itself even follows a plan due check act cycle. The introduction section then continues in 033 with risk-based thinking. At the time the 2015 standard was published, this was the new idea. And it's still, I think, something that a lot of folks are still getting a comfort level with. This is given some discussion in 033. And then in 04, there's some discussion of how ISO 9001 interrelates with some of the other management system standards, the 9000 standard and the 9004 standard, which is guidelines on process improvement. So we then continue with sections 1, 2, and 3. Now we've already gone over the scope statement. We looked at it word for word. That's found in section 1. Section 2 is called normative reference. It links to ISO 9000 for all official terms and definitions. Those terms and definitions thereby become binding. So in other words, even though the ISO 9000 standard itself is not a certifiable document, the definitions are considered mandatory in terms of interpretations, and that's why it's established that there is a normative reference to the 9000 standard emanating from ISO 9001. Section 3 is called terms and definitions, and it's actually empty. If you look at section 3, there are no official terms and definitions for ISO 9001. Now, there are other standards where there are additional terms that need to be defined, but not in ISO 9001. All of the terms used within ISO 9001 are satisfactorily defined within the ISO 9000 document. We've already gone over the content found within sections 4 through 10, so I'd like to highlight for you what comes after section 10 once we get past the auditable content. And probably one of the more helpful pieces of the puzzle comes in Annex A. And Annex A is called informative. And there's actually 8 items here where they are attempting to explain some of these more key terms and set up their intention in terms of how some of these things will be audited. In Annex A1, it's called Structure and Terminology. It states that an organization does not have to align their documentation to match ISO 9001:2015. And it doesn't even have to use the specific terms that are found in the standard. Now, a good example of this is external provider. Now, for most of the folks that are on the call, and certainly for most of the ISO 9001 certified clients we have, the phrase external provider is not a phrase that's used. The phrase that's more commonly used is supplier. Well, fine. You know, just because ISO 9001 has taken to calling these folks external providers, that doesn't mean that you suddenly have to do that. It simply means that this is how ISO 9001 is going to refer to those parties. So that's presented in section A1. In A2, we have a little bit of an explanation of the intent in changing all references of product to read products and services. In A3, we have some discussion on interested parties, and there's a very good explanation on who they mean by interested parties. In A4, there's some good discussion on risk-based thinking, and one of the things that's mentioned in A4, and I always like to mention this to someone that's new to ISO 9001, it's emphasized that you do not have to have a formal risk management process. And there's still some bad information going around out there that you have to have a formal risk management system. You don't. There's a way to meet the risk-based thinking requirement without necessarily going to the extent of a formal risk management process. And that is brought to bear in Annex A4. Now in A5, it's called applicability. There is some discussion on the concept of non-applicable clauses. The predecessor to this was called exclusions. I've actually got a couple of comments on this a little bit later in the presentation. A6 is called documented information. This phrase, documented information, this was introduced into the standard as a replacement for what were formerly referred to as records and documents and procedures. And there's some terminology that's brought to bear here. We have what we call maintained and retained documented information. So all of that is explained in Annex A6. In Annex A7, we are given some further details on organizational knowledge and some ideas on what is intended by this concept and what kind of ongoing competency challenges an organization might face. And then in A8, we have control of externally provided products and services. And this is a good explanation of what do we mean by external provider and who is included in this concept and what are the expectations. Now the standard concludes with Annex B, which is a discussion on the relationship between ISO 9001 and the various other publications from ISO, things like 9004 and 10001. And then the standard wraps with an official bibliography. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I want to address some of the key fundamental ideas from ISO 9001, and I'd like to share clausal linkages with you as well. So, if you review ISO 9001 and you want to kind of get your arms around what is this standard all about? What's it driving towards? In my analysis, I've concluded that there are 5 key ideas at play in ISO 9001. And I've broken these items up as follows: scope, processes, accountability, effectiveness, and improvement. Now there's a little bit of spillover in some of these ideas, but generally these are the 5 big concepts. So let's begin with scope. Early on in the standard, in section 4.3, the organization is directed to develop what's referred to as a scope statement. Now, a scope statement represents the extent of your quality management system and the boundaries of your quality management system. So I've provided a couple of examples here. Design, fabrication, and assembly of collapsible tripods. Distribution of fasteners. Plating, heat treating, sorting of metal stampings. Now, when you develop your scope statement, ideally, the scope statement that you develop will eventually be the same as that shown on the ISO 9001:2015 certificate issued by your registrar, PJR, hopefully in this case. Now, understand that that is not mandatory. They don't have to be word for word the same, but they have to be on the same path. They have to cover the same concepts. So maybe word for word they don't have to be the same, but conceptually they cannot be terribly different. Now, any company that is developing a scope, I always like to advise a couple of key things. Number one, do not list an item on your scope that won't be available for audit. Now, so let's say that part of what your business is that you have field installation. Well, understand that if you have field installation in your scope, we are going to have to go on site and audit the field installation activity if it's going to be listed on your certificate. If you have purchased new equipment that isn't up and running yet, and this represents an expansion of your scope, don't list it in your scope because if we're going to audit it and include it, it has to be something that is available for audit. Very key concept here. Additionally, and I do apologize for the font size here, I always like to advise people, be careful about being too wordy in your scope statement. So consider the following. Let's say that an organization has the following as their scope: laser cutting, water jet cutting, progressive die cutting, plating, heat treating, and distribution of flanges, springs, shims, bolts, and barrels. If this is the scope statement that you wish to have, understand that we have to audit every single piece of it. We have to look at laser cutting, water jet cutting, progressive die cutting, plating, heat treating, and distribution, and we have to ensure that the following product groups are sampled: flanges, springs, shims, bolts, barrels. So the scope statement, ideally, it needs to capture the essence of what you're doing within your quality management system. But a good rule of thumb is if it's getting to be longer than 15 words, it's probably too long. It's probably too wordy. And this is something that you need to be careful about when you are developing your quality management system. So the first key idea is scope. Now, our second key idea is processes. Now, processes and the whole idea of processes is initially mentioned in section 4.4. And in that section, it's directed that the organization needs to determine what their processes are and how they interface with each other. Section 4.4 even goes on to state that a quality management system is made up of processes. And this doctrine is reinforced in other ISO publications and other sets of requirements. Now, this concept of process is key, not just in ISO 9001, but in many, many other ISO standards. PJR has an entire webinar on this topic called The Interaction of Processes and Its Importance to a Successful Audit. If you've not yet viewed that webinar, I would definitely encourage you to do so. It's available on our website under previously recorded webinars. So process approach and the whole idea of processes is mentioned throughout the ISO 9001 standard. So I've pulled 6 examples of how this is mentioned and how it's brought to bear. Using a process approach from a management perspective is first mentioned in section 511D. Aligning your quality objectives to processes, that comes in section 621. Ensuring that you have competent staff for your processes, that's mentioned in 712 and 716. Ensuring that you have effective infrastructure for your processes, that's mentioned in 713. Controlling external processes, that comes in section 8.4. And then reviewing process performance is mentioned in 932 subclause C3. There are others, but the key takeaway here is that this concept of processes and the process approach at large are mentioned throughout the standard. This is a key idea and a key concept. Now, we encourage you to make your processes as personal and unique to your business as possible for a couple of reasons. You want your system to add value to your organization. you want your quality management system to be something that you understand. You want it to be something that you can wrap your arms around and say, right, this belongs to us. One of the things I always try to tell people, resist the urge to name your processes after the sections of ISO 9001 itself. The idea is not that you have a resource management process, that you have a documented information process. That's not the idea at all. The idea is that you know what the processes are that make up your quality management system, that make up your company, and that you find the way to implement ISO 9001 via those processes. That's what's really the intent here. That's really the big picture. Our third key idea can be thought of as accountability. Now, ISO 9001:2015 demands inclusion of all persons that fall within the scope of the quality management system. So, and we even saw this earlier when we were looking at the quality management principles, this whole idea of leadership and involvement of people. This is manifest in the auditable requirements of the standard. The most direct linkage here is in section 511. And in 511, it states that top management has to make itself accountable for the effectiveness of the quality management system. They have to, well, they have to have skin in the game, really, is the way to think of it. The success of the organization, the success of the quality management system is supposed to begin with the organization, with the management itself. And there's other key places where accountability is demanded. If you look at section 8.6, where it talks about product release records, inspection records, if you will, it's required that those records name names. In other words, when you issue a product and say this is a good product and it meets requirements, it needs to be on the record who made the approval. Customer complaints have to be responded to, potentially with systemic corrective action. That's in section 10.2. You have to define roles, responsibilities, and authorities. That comes from section 5.3. And all personnel are required to be cognizant of the quality policy and how they contribute to the effectiveness of the quality management system. And those ideas are found in section 522B and 7.3, respectively. So again, another idea that is deployed throughout the standard, accountability. Our fourth key idea is effectiveness. Now, ISO 9001 has a lot of requirements that get down to, is the organization measuring effectiveness? Now, the big picture here is, can you as an organization show that you know at any given time how well or how poorly things are going in your operation or within your quality management system? Now, the basic idea of effectiveness measures begins and is perhaps most succinctly established in section 441C, where it states that the organization has to determine and apply the criteria and methods, including monitoring, measuring, and related performance indicators, to ensure the effective operation and control of processes. So we see, again, another linkage here, back to processes. But the big picture here is effectiveness. Now, for effectiveness, there are a bunch of places we could point to in terms of monitoring the system and knowing, not just guessing, but knowing that things are going as they are intended. So I've got some of the more important ones listed here. Quality objectives, 621. Competency, effectiveness evaluation, 7.2. Evaluation of external providers, 8.4. inspecting product or service, 8.6, monitoring customer satisfaction, 9.12, trending within the quality management system, 9.13, the internal audit process, 9.2, management review in 9.3, and then improvement in 10.1. So lots and lots of places where you are expected to self-monitor and really have your arms around the effectiveness of not just a few things, but a lot of different things within your quality management system. The final key idea that I want to discuss today is improvement. Now, as I mentioned earlier, improvement is it's an evolution of an older concept. If you go back to the 2000 version of ISO 9001, the new idea at that time was something called continual improvement. And continual improvement, interestingly enough, had some roots in some even older standards than that. You could review QS 9000, for example, and there were concepts therein that touched on this idea. But in its current incarnation as improvement within ISO 9001:2015, there is an acknowledgement that improvement is possible in a number of key ways, not just ongoing continual improvement, but things like reactive changes, breakthroughs, and so forth. Now, improvement is primarily found in section 10.1. That's even the title of it. It's called improvement. And it states that the organization shall determine and select opportunities for improvement and implement any necessary actions to meet requirements and enhance customer satisfaction. So really, this is an idea that has been brought to bear for some time. And again, just like everything else we've looked at, improvement comes up in a number of places in the standard. And I've highlighted a couple key items for you here. In section 4.4, it states that you must continually improve your system. In 5.1.1, it says that management has to promote improvement. And in 5.2.1d, it states that your quality policy must address continual improvement. So just like everything else we've looked at, this idea of improvement is sprinkled throughout the standard. That continues then in section 5.3c, where it states that assigned responsibilities have to include reporting on opportunities for improvement. 6.1.1d talks about risk action efforts targeting improvement. 7.1.1 talks about resources should enable the organization to achieve continual improvement. 7.3 says that persons that work for the organization should be aware that their efforts are going to impact improvement. And then in 9.3.2f, it states that opportunities for improvement should be among the items discussed in the management review meeting. So in conclusion, ISO 9001:2015 remains the world's most utilized standard. Believe it or not, there's just over 1.3 million registered companies. Any organization seeking certification to ISO 9001:2015 would do well to bear in mind the big picture of what ISO 9001:2015 seeks to promote. I'd like to use this opportunity to announce something that we're excited about. We are currently working on a new course that will provide a clause-by-clause primer for anyone who is new to ISO 9001 and needs to have a better understanding and preparation for audit or other purposes. Our pending title for this course is going to be ISO 9001:2015 Clausal Overview. The course will be online. It'll be free of charge. We'll be issuing an announcement on when registration will be available. As of right now, we're targeting mid-year, late July maybe, but we will keep you posted on where things are at with the new Clausal Overview course. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. I have another ISO 9001:2015 webinar called Anticipating Auditor Expectations in Key Areas. This is presented on a quarterly basis. It explores what some of the more common issues are in an ISO 9001:2015 audit and what should be expected for those areas. We have a webinar on non-applicable clauses that explores exemptions and the right approach to take in determining which apply to you. Interaction of processes and its importance to a successful audit. We talked about this one earlier. An exploration of processes and how to correctly understand them. And we have webinars on a lot of other topics. We have webinars on Stage 1, on AS 9100, on IETF 16949, and other topics. The best way to be kept informed of the latest news is to opt in. So I'd like to invite you to visit our website at www.pjr.com. If you go to the bottom of the page and enter your email address and click subscribe, you'll be opted in for the latest updates automatically. I do thank you for your time today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I'm going to unlock the question here and see if we have any questions today. We have some compliments. Thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation. Any questions I can answer today? Okay, well, I do thank you all for your time and hope you have a great day. Thank you.